That's not natural. When did the word natural acquire this secondary meaning of something good or wholesome? We see everywhere these days claims about natural remedies, the implication being that these are somehow better than non-natural remedies, whatever precisely that might mean. We hear about things, behaviours being unnatural. We express concerns about practices that go against nature or that are opposed to the natural order. So at what point did natural come to represent a positive value judgment? And why? In Greek philosophy, the word for nature, physis, has a neutral meaning. The inherent nature, essence, or fundamental quality of something, what it is, the natural order or the physical world as a whole, everything that is. The origin or growth of something, reflecting its natural development. This refers to some kind of inner impulse or force that leads to a thing becoming what it is. So, for example, the way a plant or human being grows and develops over time when uninhibited. In fact, the root of physis is the verb phuo, which means to grow or to bring forth. For Aristotle, physis denoted the inner principle that causes growth, motion, and change. We get our words physics and physiology from these Greek words, and they both express different aspects of these meanings. But we actually get our word nature from the Latin natus, the past participle of the verb nasce, to be born. In classical Latin, natura originally refers to the innate qualities or characteristics of a person or thing, the essence with which something is born. The Greeks had another word for born rather than physis, which was gignomai, from which we get our words generation and genesis and other related words. So the Latin word natus and natura are more closely related to birth than the Greek word physis. Nevertheless, the Latin word natura comes under Greek influence and in a philosophical context at least, comes to be used in the same way as physis. The word physis is really originally morally neutral. It just describes the way things are or the way they come into being. Under Plato's influence, however, nature came to be seen as something inferior to the realm of perfect, ideal, eternal forms. Nature wasn't bad, but an imperfect copy of these perfect forms. There is, for example, the idea of a perfect circle, but no perfect circle is actually found anywhere in nature, only imperfect copies. Stoicism, which emphasized living according to nature, also recognized that not all natural impulses were beneficial. For example, unchecked emotions like anger or greed. Though these were natural, they were seen as destructive and contrary to the rational aspect of human nature. They were early Vulcans. So nature is morally ambivalent. Just because something is natural, a natural impulse, say, that doesn't automatically make it good. Gnosticism, which in some respects is the heir to Platonism, viewed the physical universe, nature, as flawed, the flawed creation of a lower deity, the demiurge, distinct from the higher spiritual realm of the true God. Nature, as part of this flawed creation, was seen as a trap for the soul, something that weighed down the soul, from which the soul sought to escape. Early Christian thought reveals an ambiguity towards nature. On the one hand, nature is often seen as inherently good because it was created by God. However, fallen nature, nature after original sin, was often regarded as corrupt or flawed. Real nature, if I may use that term, in this context is rather like Plato's eternal ideal forms, which are perfect, whereas actual nature is fallen and corrupt, which is also a little like the Gnostic concept. which perhaps explains why some early versions of Christianity drifted towards Gnosticism. Among early Christians, the natural inclinations of humanity, especially related to the flesh, such as sexual desire and greed, were viewed as obstacles to spiritual purity and salvation. This idea is prominent in the writings of St. Paul and also in later theologians like Augustine. It's also pretty common in medieval times. It gave rise to various ascetic traditions, both within and outside Christianity, which often portrayed natural desires and the physical body as sources of temptation and corruption that needed to be overcome in order to achieve spiritual enlightenment or closeness to God. In fact, the feminine was often equated with nature in this sense. Hence the practices of self-flagellation and the wearing of hair shirts. Nature was something to be overcome and suppressed. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment embodied two opposing trends. The Renaissance revived classical ideals of naturalism as beauty and order, while the Enlightenment further emphasized reason and the natural laws governing the universe. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau idealized nature as pure and good, contrasting it with the corruption of human society. His famous concept of the noble savage reflected a romanticization of the natural state as morally superior. I think we can see in this something of the modern elevation of the natural into something morally better. On the other hand, though, in the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes described the natural state of humanity as a war of all against all, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, nature without societal constraints was harsh and dangerous, requiring human intervention through laws and social contracts. So, on the one hand, society is seen as corrupting the natural order of things, but on the other hand, society is seen as taming and controlling nature. These two contradictory views seem to develop alongside each other. In 1850, Alfred Lord Tennyson, in his poem In Memoriam A.H.H., described nature as red in tooth and claw. In Canto 55, he writes, "Are God and nature then at strife, that nature lends such evil dreams? So careful of the type, she seems, so careless of the single life." There's a contrast expressed here between the ideal and the natural, the type and the single life. Darwin's theory of evolution by the process of natural selection seems to paint the natural world in a similar way, as a battle for survival, and many certainly interpret it in this way. It's worth noting here that there's also been a shift in our use of the word nature to refer more to the biological realm, the natural world, than to the whole of reality, as in the Greek usage. This shift probably reflects the Industrial Revolution and the increasing urbanization of human society, such that we might now speak of returning to nature. Here, the natural world seems to acquire a positive moral value as opposed to the mechanistic and materialistic world of human beings. We have a tendency in contemporary society to regard something natural as somehow inherently better than something which is artificial. We can see, though, that nature can be used in opposition to a whole range of terms. Natural versus ideal, natural versus supernatural or divine, natural versus spiritual, nature versus society, natural versus cultural, natural versus artificial. In some of these comparisons, nature is seen as the positive aspect, while its opposite is seen as negative. In other comparisons, nature is seen as the negative and its opposite as the positive. In some cases, this can go either way, and in some cases, it's neutral. Simply describing something as natural doesn't automatically imply that it's somehow better than something which isn't. It certainly doesn't automatically imply that it's beneficial or even harmless. Death, illness, disease, even murder and violence may be regarded as natural. So might the impulse to cure disease, combat death, and curb violence be regarded as natural. Nature is, I think, ultimately an abstraction. Paradoxically, it's an abstraction from what actually is, which is what the word phusis means. Plato's view of nature was that it was an imperfect reflection of some world of ideal forms. In fact, though, the idea of nature itself is an abstraction from reality. We look at an actual physical table and abstract from that the idea of table, from that or perhaps from several actual examples of it. We try to determine the true nature of something, and in order to do so, we abstract from its actual physical reality. We try to capture the idea of natural man, which some Enlightenment philosophers saw in the noble savage, unencumbered by anything artificial. This is most definitely an abstraction, though, because the noble savage is no more or less natural than we are. No more natural, because even the most primitive society is a cultural as well as a natural phenomenon. And no less natural, because all culture is ultimately also natural. A natural remedy is not really any more natural than an unnatural remedy. Both depend on culture and some degree of human intervention. Curing illness and disease is itself to interfere with natural processes or the natural course of events. Even less are natural remedies necessarily better than unnatural remedies. They may or may not be more effective. They may or may not be less dangerous. The word natural has been used throughout human history with both positive and negative moral connotations. I prefer its original, entirely neutral philosophical sense, the inherent essence of things.